activities with that, so we took a little bit of a break, but we are back. And so just to kind of reorient us or reground us, the minor prophets. The minor prophets is what we have been studying now for the last about 3 or 4 weeks, and we're going to continue that study. And so we're switching gears a little bit this morning. But again, I want to reorient us about what we have been looking at. So again, one more time, just to refresh us, in terms of the minor prophets, a quick overview. So first of all, the minor prophets make up the collection of the last 12 books of the Old Testament. Last 12 books. So the very, very last book of the Old Testament is Malachi. And if you go backwards 11 books, you'll hit Hosea. So the collection of Hosea to Malachi, that collection of 12 books makes up what we refer to as the minor prophets. That's the first thing. The second thing, as an overview of the minor prophets, is that that collection of prophets, they are designated as minor, not because of anything about how important they are or are not. It has nothing to do with their importance, but it's based on the amount that was written by them or about them, not based on their importance. So that's why that term minor prophets is used. And then of course the converse of that is also true. The so-called major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, where there are many chapters there, they're called the major prophets, not because they're more important than the other prophets, but because there's so much more written about them. Okay, so that's another bit of overview. It is very difficult. Scholars do not all agree on the actual chronological order of the minor prophets, but we had to land on something. And so I did pick an order that a good number of scholars support, but again, full disclosure, not all scholars support. So I'm putting that up on the screen now. Of the 12 books, we already did Joel, so I sort of grayed Joel out. We will begin this morning a look at Jonah, and then following Jonah, we will cover, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and then the final 7 if we can get to it. I honestly don't know if we will get to all 12 through this quarter. But after Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Obadiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So this is the order that you see. And again, you guys did a great job on Joel for the last few weeks, and now we're going to pick up with Jonah this morning. So then that's where we are in terms of our overview. I want to remind you some things about his history and where the minor prophets fit into the history of world events. And then we'll get into our study of Jonah. So you remember this timeline that I put up on the screen? I did this a few times in the past just to sort of orient us. And there's some significant things that have happened in world events that kind of help us see where the minor prophets fit into that scheme. When you go left on this timeline, you're going further back in history. And when you go to the right on this timeline, you're going forward in history. So this particular timeline on the right side ends or caps out at AD 33, which is when Jesus was crucified on the cross. And I did that just to give us a sense. So the nation of Israel, they were in Egyptian bondage between 1800 to 1400 BC. Following that, the Exodus, when God delivered them from Egypt and brought them to the Promised Land, that occurred around 1300 BC, or in the 1300s BC. You flash forward, when God formed his nation, Israel, when they began as a united kingdom under 3 monarchs or kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, that was in the 1000s BC. You go forward about 80 years or so, or thereabouts, you might recall, and this is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 11 and 1 Kings chapter 12, when because of Solomon's disobedience to God, one of the punishments, one of the outcomes of that was that God divided the kingdom. You remember that? And so there was a northern kingdom, which was called Israel usually, and then the southern kingdom, sometimes referred to as Judah. That happened around the year 920 BC. That's right in the middle of the timeline there. ministries of those 12 minor prophets followed after the kingdom split. And that's important to understand because some of those prophets, some of those minor prophets prophesied to the northern kingdom. Some of those minor prophets prophesied to the southern kingdom. And their prophetic ministry occurred, and those little squiggly lines mean about or approximately. So from approximately 835 BC to approximately 415 BC, about 400 years, all of those prophets from Joel to Malachi, that's when their ministry happened. And then about 800 years later, Jesus comes on the scene. All right, that's the timeline, okay? So again, I also want you to make sure to take notice of here. And I know it's a little dark on the map, but again, remember I told you that the history tells us, the biblical history tells us that God split the two kingdoms. So the dark blue, that's the northern kingdom. That's where Samaria was the capital. And then sort of that pink right below it, that was the kingdom of Judah. That's where Jerusalem was. That is the southern kingdom. I want you to pay attention to all of the heathen nations that surrounded Israel and Judah. You see here in this gold color here that the kingdom of Edom was near or around the two kingdoms. Moab in the purple. You continue to go north there. The kingdom of Ammon. These are all heathen nations. Notice at the upper, this would be the northeast corner, sort of a light blue. It says kingdom of Aram Damascus. I put in red Syria. Aram is also known as Syria, but if you go north of that, notice that there with the red circle, the dotted circle, it also says the Assyrian Empire. I want us to understand Assyria and Syria are two different nations. The names sound similar, two different nations, and then it's not pictured on this map, but because my map's not big enough, but pretty much due east of Ammon is where Babylonia is. These are all heathen nations surrounding the northern and southern kingdoms. And what's important about that, or the question I posed before is, if just imagine God's people surrounded by all of these heathen nations. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? Right? And so these heathen nations, over the course of time, really had some pretty detrimental influences on Israel. There were some of those heathen nations that invaded Israel at certain periods of time, or Judah at certain periods of time. They would make war. And you remember the story of Nebuchadnezzar from Babylonia taking Israelites into Babylonian captivity. You remember that, right? All of these things happen, right? All right. So I'm just trying to ground us around sort of this as we make our way to continue our study. Okay? One more thing I want to show you here. So don't forget, minor prophets ministry from 835 BC to 415 BC. I put a red circle around it because I'm going to blow up just that section of the timeline to further show you some other world events that were happening during the time that those minor prophets had their prophetic ministries. Here's the bigger timeline from 835 to 415 BC. First of all, notice that around 732 BC, Syria, not Assyria, but Syria and the northern kingdom Israel together invaded the southern kingdom. You can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 16. You go forward a little further. Around 725 BC, the northern kingdom, Israel, actually falls to Assyria. You read about that in 2 Kings 17. Around 700 BC, Assyria then invades the southern kingdom. You can read about that in Judah in 2 Kings 18, pardon me. And then finally, around 586 BC, that is when Nebuchadnezzar comes and ravishes the southern kingdom. And again, that's recorded in 2 Kings 24 and 25. So I'm just trying to show you some of the world events, and I'm trying to show you how these heathen nations influenced both Israel and the southern kingdom. Okay? This is all of our review. So now we're going to turn our attention to the book of Jonah. I want you to go ahead and make your way to the book of Jonah now, please. Raise your hand if you are familiar with the book of Jonah. Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're familiar with it. All right, all right. Most hands have gone up. And I anticipated that. And sometimes what can be hard is that when you're familiar with something, right, it can be easy to sort of lean on the conclusion that you've drawn already about that thing. You know, if you've seen the movie 3 times already and now it's your 4th time, well, you kind of zone out on some of it because you know the dialogue and the parts of what's coming up. But I want to encourage you to try to discipline yourself to read Jonah this time with a fresh pair of eyes. And we all know the climactic part of the story where, this man gets swallowed up by a great fish. Right? We know that part of the story. I want to suggest to you that although that is fascinating, I want to suggest that there are many fascinating details, many fascinating things that we can learn from the experiences of Jonah. And so I want to encourage you to discipline yourself to try to dig in. And so for that reason, we are going to walk through this, not exactly verse by verse, but it's going to be close. We're not going to just read it. We're going to read a little bit, talk about it, and read some more. Okay? Before we get into it, and I'm going to ask for some volunteers to read here in a minute. One last thing I'm going to point out here is that there is something that's kind of unique about the book of Jonah compared to other minor prophet books. And that unique thing is that whereas the other minor prophets, like Joel, for example, will tell us that, the word came to Joel, and then it talks about what Joel had to say on behalf of God to his people. The book of Jonah is largely about Jonah. Right? First of all, it's written primarily in third person, where the author says, well, he did this, or he said that, rather than, the prophet himself kind of saying, well, I did this, or I did that. So it's just different. It's more about the prophet, I would say, in some instances, than it is about the prophetic message. So it's interesting. It's unique in that way. Okay? All right. Sound good? All right, let's keep going. I hope you made your way to Jonah. Again, I want us to focus carefully on all the details. And Brother Jerry Charles, I'm going to pick on you this morning and just ask you read often for us, and so I'm going to ask you if you will own the responsibility of reading the verses that I'm going to put up on the screen for all of chapter 1. And I'm going to put them up in a second, except for the first verse, which I'll take. But then the other ones, they're broken up into different sections. I'm going to populate the screen in a moment, if you don't mind doing that for us. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. I'm going to read verse 1 myself. And verse 1 says, the word of the Lord. I'm in Joel. It would help if I was in Jonah, right? All right. Although that starts with the word of the Lord too. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of, and that word is pronounced, the son of Amittai, saying, and we're just going to pause here. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. So we understand, first of all, that just like with all other prophets, the prophets do not speak on their own behalf. And let me say that differently. True prophets of God do not speak on their own behalf. They speak the word of the Lord that is given to them. The scripture tells us that Jonah is the son of who? Amittai, okay? All right? Hold your finger on Jonah chapter 1 and go backwards to 2 Kings chapter 14. Second Kings. Hold your finger there. We won't be in 2 Kings long. 2 Kings chapter 14. Jonah, the son of Amittai. I want to point out something to you. Maybe you've known this, or maybe this will be new for you this morning. The book of Jonah is not the only place in the Bible where it records his prophetic work. In 2 Kings chapter 14, starting in verse 23. Ricky, do you have that, Sailor? You got 2 Kings? Will you read 2 Kings 14, 23 through 25, please?
In the 15th year of Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. And he was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the sea of the Arabah, in accordance with the word of the Lord, God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath.
You did great with all those names. Thank you. You did excellent. What I want you to see here, and this is just a blurb, that God's word doesn't give us any more detail other than that. But what I want you to see is that during the reign of a northern king, Jeroboam II, not the same Jeroboam who ruled when the two kingdoms split. This is many years later, but under the reign of Jeroboam II, evidently Jonah prophesied to that king by the word of the Lord to make that king know that he would be successful with his military campaign. That's all God's word tells us about it. But I just want you to understand, I just want you to see this bit of trivia that the book of Jonah, that Jonah was a legitimate prophet. He prophesied during other parts of the nation's history, but most of what he did is recorded in what is called the book of Jonah. Okay? So that was all I wanted to reference there. So now, Brother Jerry, you are up, and you're going to see these. So right now, just verse 2, Brother Jerry, of Jonah chapter 1.
Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me.
All right. Verse 2, the word of the Lord, verse 1, comes to Jonah. And that word from God is for him to arise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it. And the reason is because God says the wickedness of Nineveh has come up before him. Now, I'll put a different map on the screen just because I want us to see what and where God, I'm going to blow this up a little bit. There we go. Let me re-ground you one more time. Aram, which is also Syria, and then in the northeast, Assyria is up there. Want to remind you here that that's where Israel, the northern and southern kingdom are. And then Assyria, and then notice here that that's where Nineveh is. Now already, when I regrounded all of us through walking through the world history events, God is telling Jonah to go to Nineveh, which is part of Assyria. What do we already know about the relationship between Assyria and Israel? What do we already know? I told you this a few minutes ago. Okay, so all right, so that's a good start. Melissa says, so one is heathen, that's true. Assyria is a heathen nation, Israel is not. What else do we know about their relationship? Were they allies? Were they enemies? What do we know? Remember how I told you that well, I'll give it away now, but I said that Assyria had, go ahead, Poppy, you want to say something? Go ahead. Yeah, well, just that Assyria invaded, right? Invaded Israel, right? Okay, so they're enemies. They're enemies. And in verse 2, in so many words, God is telling his prophet to go not to the people of Israel, but to go to Israel's enemies and prophesy. I want to make sure we understand that. Hear the rest of our passages, Brother Jerry, so we're going to do now 3 through 6, please.
So Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and was down into it to go within Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. The Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. Then the sailors became afraid, and every man cried to his God, and they threw the cargo which was in the ship into the sea, the life was for them. But Jonah had gone down below to the hold of the ship, laid down and fallen sound asleep. So the captain approached him and said, "How is it that you are sleeping? Get up, follow your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us, so that we will not perish."
Perfect. Question I have for you is just on this little bit of reading, what can we conclude or what can we deduce about the crew of the ship? Just tell me, in that little bit of information, what conclusion or conclusions can we draw about the crew of the ship that Jonah is on?
They're not Jewish.
Say again?
They're not Jewish.
All right.
Call on your God.
Interesting. So Sister Nancy's response is that the crew is likely not Jewish. And why did you say that?
Because they said, call out to your God.
Okay. You guys saw that? They could call out to you, they're in this panic situation and amongst themselves and even ultimately to Jonah. They're saying, call on your God. This is some polytheistic group that evidently believes in lots of gods, little g. And in their panic situation, that's what they appear to believe in. Very good catch there. Let's keep going. 7 through 12.